but I still remember well the day when we first heard of the martyring of 5 missionaries to the Aka Indians in Ecuador, and the feeling of electrical shock that went through the Christian community was not easily forgotten. In the days that followed, we heard more of the details and of the individuals involved, and certainly people who are familiar with the modern missionary movement are certainly familiar with the name of Jim Elliot and Elisabeth Elliot, because through their ministry, missions took on a new dimension and became known in a new way. Mrs. Elliot continued the task of Bible translation for some years. Many of us have been exposed to her writing through books and articles in various periodicals. When we contacted her some 2 years ago now and asked whether there might be a possibility that she would be willing to come to North American Baptist College in order to share with us in our spiritual emphasis days, we were thrilled when she said yes. And we've been looking forward to these days, and we have already enjoyed the session this morning, the theme of all of the messages being at your disposal, Lord, and seeing that emphasis this morning on the Lordship of Christ was a great thing. And we know that during the remainder of these days, both tonight, tomorrow morning in the chapel service, and then again tomorrow evening, we are looking forward to your ministry. We welcome you and your husband here with us, and we know that these are going to be great days. Thank you. Will you come and speak to us?
Thank you. Before I speak, if I may mention a couple of books. There is a book table somewhere, isn't there, Lars? Okay, right over there. It may be a little bit bewildering if you don't know anything about any of them, so I'd like to mention 2 in particular. One is called Let Me Be a Woman, and it was my wedding present to my daughter Valerie. Notes on what it means to be a woman. It's not just about marriage by any means, it's about femininity, and it will explain, I think, clearly enough why I can't be a feminist myself. Then there's a book called Through Gates of Splendor, which is the story of the 5 men who were killed in Ecuador. This is the 25th anniversary edition. The 25th anniversary was 2 years ago, but it has an epilogue which brings the news up a little bit more up to date than when it first came out. And I can't resist telling you a little story about this book. I was having dinner with some people in Michigan a few years ago, and they were strangers to me, and I was to some of them. And in the middle of the meal, I don't know exactly what clicked in the mind of a certain pastor who was there at the table, but suddenly he looked at me and he said, "Now let me see." He said, "You wrote a book, is that right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Refresh my memory now, what was the name of that?" Well, I was a little taken aback because I didn't quite know which book he was talking about, and I didn't like to say which one. But my host came to my rescue, and he said to the man, "Was it Through Gates of Splendor?" And the man said, "Yeah, I think that was the name of it, Through Gates of Splendor." Gee, he said, "Did you write that?" And I said, "Yes." Well, he said, "It's interesting that I should meet you today because I just got rid of that book yesterday." He said, "I was cleaning out my study and I got rid of a whole lot of," and he just stopped himself before he said junk. I'm sure that's what he meant. But he said, I took that book down to the rummage sale, but even for 25 cents, nobody wanted it. I had to bring it home again. Well, I felt so bad that I didn't think fast enough to say, "Look, I'll give you 35 cents for it." It would have made his day. But the Lord has all kinds of wonderful ways of bringing us down a few pegs. Just before my first grandchild was born, which was 6 years ago, I was telling an old friend about his impending birth. She was asking me how my daughter was, and I said, well, she's about to have her first child. And my friend looked at me and she said, well, it's about time. You're certainly looking grandmotherly enough. My talk tonight is on the authority of Christ. This morning I told the students in chapel about one of Jim's favorite verses, which he wrote into my yearbook when I was hopeful for some sweet message. The words were from 2 Timothy 2:4. No soldier on active service gets involved in civilian affairs, but he is wholly at his commanding officer's disposal. And that's a clear indication that Jim Elliot recognized the authority of Christ. He wasn't being facetious. I found out later that he had at least as much interest in me as I had in him. I wasn't just one of the hopeless hopeful. The women on campus that were very interested in Jim, I didn't know that I had any hope of his interest, but I found out afterwards that I did. But he was struggling with the fact that he believed that God wanted him to be single, perhaps for the rest of his life, but at least until he had been on the mission field for a year or so. And so he wasn't about to make any commitments. And I'm convinced from my own experience and from Jim's, as well as from observation of many young people since those days when I was young, that perhaps the most crucial point which tests the validity of our commitment to Jesus Christ is the matter of the love life. If Christ is not Lord of your passions, he's not Lord at all. And as I travel around and speak to students, I really am aghast at some of the things that I hear them say. I get a lot of letters from students asking for advice on these matters. And the state of things, even on Christian campuses, is enough to curl the hair of an old lady like me. I find it just mind-boggling to see how few Christian students seem to have thought of the fact that Jesus Christ would have anything at all to do with their love life. They seem to think that that's a separate compartment. Now, I trust that is not the state of things here at this college and divinity school. I know nothing about how things are here. I haven't talked to anybody about this subject. But it is a matter of deep concern to me, so much so that I have written a book about it, which will be out in January, called Passion and Purity. But I'd like to read some familiar verses from the 6th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Again, I don't take my cues from my feelings or from what happens to be the popular notions of the day, but from this book. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12, I am free to do anything, you say. Yes, but not everything is for my good. It is not true that the body is for lust. It is for the Lord. Do you not know that your bodies are limbs and organs of Christ? Shun fornication. Every other sin that a man can commit is outside the body, but the fornicator sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a shrine of the indwelling Holy Spirit, and the Spirit is God's gift to you? You do not belong to yourselves. You were bought at a price. Then honor God in your body. If we say, at your disposal, Lord, we're saying that we recognize that we are not our own, that we have been bought at the price of his precious blood. If we recognize the authority of Christ anywhere in our lives, we must recognize it in matters of the heart. As I told the students this morning, I really didn't get to know Jim Elliot until I was a senior in college. He was a junior. And during that year, my hopes began to build up more and more that there might be some reciprocation of my feelings. I was hardly able even to acknowledge to myself that I was in love with this man. It hurt my pride to think that I could possibly fall in love with somebody that didn't apparently have any interest at all in me. But gradually I had to acknowledge that to myself, and I began to struggle with the question as to whether or not I was willing to be single for the rest of my life. Actually, I better correct myself. I had been struggling with that question before I had any idea of Jim Elliot, of his interest in me or mine in him. But maybe if you're anything like me, you've made some hypothetical commitments to God, and then all of a sudden he tests the validity of that commitment, and you're not so sure that you really meant what you said. I knew that I was to be a missionary. I knew that if I went to the mission field single, my chances of ever getting married would be sharply reduced. And we had what we called senior panic in those days. I don't know whether you suffer from that. But, the idea being, if you haven't found a spouse in a Christian college, where are you ever going to find one? And as you get on toward the senior year, that panic sets in. Well, I really didn't have any potential mate on the horizon when I prayed the prayer telling the Lord that I would be willing to be single if that's what he wanted me to do. There was no chance whatsoever that I could think of for my ever getting married. And so, of course, the only sure way in which God could test my commitment was to bring along a real live human being in the form of Jim Elliot. Just a few weeks, maybe about 2 weeks or so before I graduated, we were having a Foreign Missions Fellowship breakfast at a park, and I was part of the cleanup crew. And as people began to drift away one after another, I suddenly realized that there were only 4 people left in the park. A guy named Bill, a girl named Van, and a guy named Jim Elliot, and I. And I was just dumping some stuff into the garbage can when Jim came over and he said, "Can I walk you home?" I said, "Sure." So we started to walk down the sidewalk, and without any preliminaries whatsoever, he turned to me and he said, "Well, I think we better get squared away how we feel about each other." I was really taken aback because I thought it was quite presumptuous of him to assume that there were any feelings at all on my part, because I thought I'd done a very good job of concealing them. I certainly learned, if I never learned anything else from my mother about dating and boys and whatnot, it was, you don't chase them. You don't, by so much as the flicker of an eyelash, allow them to think that you are interested in them unless they have showed some interest in you. And so I had done, I thought, quite well in concealing my feelings, but maybe Jim was proud enough to think that if he was in love with me, I surely must be in love with him. But at any rate, to make a long story short, we didn't go back to the campus. We turned around and went back out and sat in the park. And we talked for 7 hours. And I found out that Jim had been going through a struggle all during that year as to whether or not he was willing to go to the mission field single. And of course I confessed that I had been going through the same struggle. And he told me that he'd been in love with me for a long time, and he couldn't understand how I could have been so unaware of it. He said, "Didn't you have the least idea?" And I said, "Well, every now and then I had some reason to wonder if there might be some possible feelings on your part," but I said then I would tell myself, "Don't be a fool. He couldn't possibly look at you twice. Don't start reading into everything that he does." It was a strange situation that we found ourselves in, because I thought I was going to Africa as a missionary. He was definitely going to South America. Each time through both high school and college that I had had to make a choice about a language to study, I had always eliminated Spanish, because that was the one language I was sure I was never going to need. And here we were, both of us having gone through the same struggle, both of us having told the Lord that we would be single for the rest of our lives if that was His will. Both of us were Greek majors. We had all kinds of things in common. Both of us interested in missions from way back. And why not just leap to the conclusion that God had brought us together? It could have looked very simple. But both Jim and I were far too realistic and perhaps too honest with ourselves to evade the fact that this tornado of passion that we were experiencing was really too big for us to handle. And we ourselves didn't dare to do anything at all about it without the clear leading of God. And Jim knew what his leading was, and that was that he was to go to the mission field single and stay that way until he could determine for himself whether or not the work to which he was called required a single man rather than a married one. We had, as I said, a couple of weeks before I was going to graduate, and we took some more walks and talked more about this strange situation in which we found ourselves. And one night we wandered rather unwittingly into a cemetery and found ourselves sitting on a convenient slab talking about these things. And I had been doing some plain and fancy thinking, and I told Jim that it really didn't make sense to me to tell ourselves that we were turning the whole thing over to God for Him to handle if we were going to keep our hands on by corresponding. What Jim had been saying to me was, I'm going to the mission field single, so see you around. Well, he wasn't going to see much of me because I lived in New Jersey and he lived in Oregon, and I was graduating. So his idea was that we would correspond, and I said, does it make sense for us to say that we really are going to turn this over to God, and if He wants to bring us together in His own miraculous way, He can do that? It wouldn't make sense if we were going to be corresponding. So I suggested that really the only sensible thing to do was to just say goodbye and forget the whole thing and just leave it up to God to bring us together again if He ever wanted to. And so we sat in silence for a while, and finally Jim said, well, I know you're right. And the reason I know it is because this morning in my reading, I had the story of Abraham and Isaac, and God was saying to him that He wanted him to offer up as a burnt sacrifice the most precious thing in his life. And Jim said, the lesson was for me, because he said, you were the most precious thing in my life, and so I put you on the altar. And that's where you're going to stay, unless God does for me what He did for Abraham and stays my hand. And so we sat some more in silence, and then suddenly we realized that the moon had risen behind us, and it was casting the shadow of a stone cross between us on that slab. You know, we weren't sitting very close. The shadow of a cross. One of my favorite hymns from high school days was Beneath the Cross of Jesus. And one of the stanzas says, I ask no other sunshine than the sunshine of thy face. Well, I went home and I wrote a poem. Those were my poetry writing days. I got over those. But this is what I wrote apropos of this situation. Hold thou thy cross between us, blessed Lord. Let us love thee. To us thy power afford to remain prostrate at thy pierced feet. There is no other place where we may meet. Set thou our faces as a flint of stone to do thy will. Our goal be this alone. O God, our hearts are fixed. Let us not turn. Consume all our affections. Let thy love burn. I won't tell you the rest of the Jim Elliot story tonight. You can read it in a book called Shadow of the Almighty. But that's just one illustration of what it means to bring your passions under the authority of Christ. If Jesus Christ is Lord, and if I am at His disposal, then I must bring also my mind. You heard the passage from 2 Corinthians 10 read a few minutes ago, and let me reread verse 4, verses 3 through 6. Weak men we may be, but it is not as such that we fight our battles. The weapons we wield are not merely human, but divinely potent to demolish strongholds. We demolish sophistries and all that rears its proud head against the knowledge of God. We compel every human thought to surrender in obedience to Christ. Remember those words, every human thought to surrender in obedience to Christ. Human thoughts cover a wide range, but let me just suggest a few areas in which you may need to rethink some things if you're going to bring every human thought under his authority. Self-image. You know, that's a term that modern psychology has given us, and I think it's a very pernicious one. It has made us, even us Christians, unhealthily introspective. Sitting around worrying about our self-image is a dead-end street. I was talking a few months ago in a meeting about Jesus' words, if you want to be my disciple, you must give up your right to yourself. And that certainly cuts across everything that psychiatry is telling us, doesn't it? But a man asked the question in the question and answer period afterwards. He said, but how in the world would you ever give a verse like that to somebody that already has a poor self-image? Well, of course, I didn't say it. Jesus said it, and so I take it for granted that what Jesus said is for every one of us. It doesn't make any difference what kind of a self-image we have. We have to give up our right to ourselves. But I have a good friend who used to be a psychiatrist. He's given it up because he thinks psychiatry is a lot of nonsense. But I asked him, he's gone into general practice now, and I said, now what would you have said in answer to that question? He's a Christian man. And he said, well, anybody that's got a poor self-image, I can tell him what's wrong with him in one word. I said, what's that? He said, pride. Is that a strange answer? Does that surprise you? It surprised me. I said, well, would you elaborate a little bit? He said, the person that has a poor self-image is angry at God because he thinks that he deserved better than he got. In other words, he was dealt a poor hand of cards. And so he goes around thinking, well, if I had so-and-so's gifts, and if I could do that, but I can't do anything, and all these other people can do everything, and I can never serve the Lord the way so-and-so can, and poor little me. And, of course, he's wallowing in self-pity and expecting everybody to feel sorry for him and make allowances for him and shore him up and pat him on the back and cheer him up and improve his self-image, which is not ever going to improve as long as he has such a poor image of who God is. You know, our self-image is going to be determined by our God image. And as Calvin pointed out in the introduction to his Institutes, the only true knowledge of ourselves comes through the knowledge of God. So when you try to find out who you are, you're really wasting an awful lot of time, because you can find out much faster who you are by finding out who God is. In fact, the better I get to know God, the less I can stand what I find out about myself, and I'm not too eager to know any more about it. Bringing your mind under the authority of Christ means thinking as a Christian, not as the world thinks. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold, Paul says to the Romans in chapter 12. Let God remold your mind from within. Have you let God mold or remold your mind on the subjects of, for example, divorce, abortion, homosexuality, the ordination of women, civil rights, whether or not a Christian is obligated to have children if he gets married, whether it's right for the mother of young children to put them in a daycare center and go to work. This word self-actualization, can you think Christianly about these things? I think it was Sir Joshua Reynolds who said that there is no length to which mankind will not go to avoid the real labor of thinking. Somebody has said, if you make people think they're thinking, they will love you. If you make them think, they will hate you. If it's difficult to make people think at all, it's much more difficult to make them think as Christians. And the only way we can do this is to bring every thought under the authority of Christ. Dorothy Sayers wrote a book called Unpopular Opinions. She held quite a few of them. I suppose most of us, at some time or other, have experienced what it's like to hold an unpopular opinion. It's not very comfortable, is it? I remember when my daughter was only 16 years old, they were having a discussion in her social studies class in high school as to whether or not the voting age in America should be lowered to 16. And almost everyone in the class was 16, and everyone except my daughter voted yes, that it should be. And everybody, of course, swung around and looked at her and said, well, what are you, some kind of nut? And the teacher said, would you care to tell us why you don't think the voting age should be lowered to the age of 16? And with all simplicity, she said, because I don't think we know enough. Well, that was a very unpopular opinion. We must bring everything that exalts itself against the knowledge of God under His authority. Those things which I just mentioned are called controversial issues. Of some of them, I would say, I don't see that they're controversial at all. Scripture is terribly clear. But how about these that are certainly not controversial issues, but ones with which we all struggle, I think? Anxiety. Hannah Whitehall Smith, in her remarkable little book, The Christian Secret of a Happy Life, says that we ought to take a pledge that we will never doubt God, just as an alcoholic takes a pledge that he will never touch another drop of alcohol. It's a habit and a luxury, and if you don't think it's a habit and a luxury, you try to kick it. See how long it takes you. But anxiety is a sin. Philippians 4 says, don't be anxious about anything whatsoever. I was born a worrywart, and I come from a long line of champion worriers. So I might excuse myself on that ground that it happens to be my temperament. But as I read my Bible, I find that it's a sin. Let's call it a sin. Let's not call it a weakness or a temperamental peculiarity or any of the other things that we use to excuse our sins. It's doubting God. It's refusal to trust. The psalmist said, what time I am afraid, I will trust. That's a choice. He describes the feeling, and then he describes what he's going to do about it. When I am afraid, I will trust. And again he says, I will trust and not be afraid. What about brooding over wrongs done to you? Anybody here ever done that? Somebody does something really nasty, and you chew and chew and chew and chew over it like a dog over a bone. You regurgitate it like a cow her cud, and you chew and chew and chew some more. It will destroy you. Instead of brooding over the wrong, we have one choice as a Christian, and that is to forgive. If your brother wrongs you, forgive him. How many times? Would 7 be enough? No, Jesus said 70 times 7. How about discontent? You remember the story of the children of Israel complaining? And God got so angry at their complaining that He caused them to spend 40 more years in the wilderness. They would have gotten to where they were going in 14 days, and it took them 40 years instead because they complained. One of the things that I noticed about the Indians in the jungle was that they never complained. They weren't Christians. They just accepted life with humility and patience. I never saw an argument between adults. I never saw a fight. I never even saw children fight. I lived right next door to a house where there were 3 women married to the same man. They all lived under the same roof. They got along perfectly, as far as I could tell, and I could watch everything that went on 24 hours a day. They didn't have any walls on their house, and I didn't have any on mine. They watched everything that went on in my house, too. They never complained. They never complained about the weather. We had 144 inches of rain per year. That's pretty bad weather. And whenever we went out for a walk or a hike or a trek, we took it for granted that we would get wet before we got home. Very often the mud was up to our knees. I never in my life saw an Indian complain or heard an Indian complain about the weather. They hardly had any vocabulary words to describe weather, in fact. They didn't talk about it. It was so bad, I guess, they had just long since decided it wasn't worth discussing. They would get thorns in their feet, they'd get stung by caterpillars or bees. They didn't complain. Even the little kids, I never saw them complain. And of course my daughter was reared with these children, and so she doesn't complain. I don't take any credit for it. Her husband said to me, "This woman never complains." Now I wonder how many of you husbands have that testimony. How many of you wives think that your husband could possibly say that about you? I know my husband can't say it about me. It's time we brought those complaining thoughts under the authority of Christ. And what's the antidote? Give thanks. Ambitions. Do you bring your ambitions under His lordship? Some of you, I'm sure, have read the books of Amy Carmichael. I think one of the most powerful, and certainly the shortest of her books, is a little one called If. And if is a series of statements, one sentence per page. The rest of the page is blank. And I remember Mr. Maxwell of Prairie Bible Institute saying that the reason the rest of the page is left blank is so that we can, all of us, write in big letters across it, guilty. Each statement ends with, "Then I know nothing of Calvary love." And one of the statements is, "If I covet any place on earth but the foot of the cross, but the dust at the foot of the cross, then I know nothing of Calvary love." If I covet any place on earth but the dust at the foot of the cross, then I know nothing but of Calvary love. How many of us have been embittered because somebody else got the credit for something that we felt we deserved it for? Or somebody else got the promotion? Or somebody else got the recognition for something that we had cooperated in that we deserved some of the thanks for? We want to move up in the social scale, the economic scale, the academic scale. We covet many places besides the dust at the foot of the cross. Bringing our lives under the lordship of Jesus Christ means not only our passions and our minds, but our habits. And of course, these three things are not necessarily separable. They may all come down to the same thing. But habits are among the strongholds that Paul is talking about in this very passage, which must be brought down, which must be demolished. And they cannot be demolished except by spiritual weapons. Weak men we may be, he says, but it is not as such that we fight our battles. The weapons that we wield are not carnal, but spiritual. What kind of habits govern your life? Do you have a habit of thinking of yourself first? Do you have a habit of thinking of yourself as ungifted? To refuse to acknowledge the gifts that God has given you is like a slap in the face to Him, isn't it? I wonder if any of you women have ever been resentful that you weren't a man in this man's world. Have you ever thanked God for the gift of femininity? Have you men ever thanked God for the gifts that go along with masculinity, such as authority, the kind of authority that Christ demonstrated when He laid down His life? Not very many men want that kind. How you think of Christ will determine how you think of yourself. In Luke 17, Jesus tells this parable. He said, "Suppose one of you has a servant plowing or minding sheep. When he comes back from the fields, will the master say, 'Come along at once and sit down'? Will he not rather say, prepare my supper, fasten your belt, and then wait on me while I have my meal? You can have yours afterwards. Is he grateful to the servant for carrying out his orders? So with you. When you have carried out all your orders, you should say, we are servants and deserve no credit. We have only done our duty. That would be an excellent motto for anyone in Christian service. A very good place for a missionary to start. We are servants and deserve no credit. We have only done our duty. We'll never get to the place where we recognize that until we recognize the lordship of Jesus Christ. David Livingstone said, if Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then nothing that I do for him can ever be called a sacrifice. Credit? Who in the world do we think we are? Paul says in Romans 12, don't cherish inflated ideas of your own importance. We're nothing. We have done only that which was our duty to do, if we've done it all. And I don't know who of us would say that we've done it all. He is my master. He holds the rights. All the rights. People have said to me, have you been resentful about the things that God has done to you? And of course, just that terminology is a giveaway of that person's attitude. The things that God has done to me. And what they mean is my first husband's death by spears, my second husband's death by cancer, losing my language notes, as I told about this morning. Some of those things, which of course are hard to take. They're baffling. God doesn't answer all the questions about them, but can I be bitter if I believe that God loves me? And if I have asked him to run my life? I'm only his servant. I'm wholly at his disposal. He has all the rights. And so he can do with me or with anything I possess anything he wants. Anything at all. What I want is the will of God, nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. At your disposal, Lord, the authority of Jesus Christ over the passions, the mind, and the habits. May God help us to recognize our servanthood.